Welcome to Healing from Grief and Loss, where top experts guide you on your journey to find strength, comfort, and joy again. I'm Andrea, your host, and on today's show, my beautiful guest expert is Barbara Rubel. I'm so excited that she's here. Barbara has a lot of talent and knowledge and wisdom and inspiration, and I'm so excited for you to be here today with her and I. Barbara is a keynote speaker, she is a trainer, she is a coach, she is an author, and she is even an expert in thanatology and vicarious trauma. I'm so excited to have you here, Barbara. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be on your show. And I say that because you give me the opportunity to share the story, to share my story, my lost narrative of my mom and dad. And even though they're both gone now, it is joyful to be able to share the story because they were alive. They were a part of my life. And even though they're both gone, dead, telling the story of their life and their death brings me joy. Because what would happen if we could not share our stories? What would that do to us if we were not able to talk about what it means to have that person in our life and what it means when that person is taken from us? My dad was taken from me. He was a New York City police officer and he killed himself. My mom was one of the first New York City police officers, and he used her weapon to end his life. And he did this when I was in the hospital about to give birth to not one, not two, but three baby boys. And after his suicide, I needed to find meaning in his death. How could he do this? How could he do this to me? How could he do this to my mom? How could he do this to himself? And I became a thanatologist. And a thanatologist is one who specializes in mourning. And for me, it was mourning a traumatic loss. It's looking at the aspects of bereavement, and in my case, suicide postvention. I wrote books about grief. I got involved with different organizations that focus on grief. I facilitated support group. I even became a hospice bereavement coordinator. I wanted to help people who were experiencing losses like me, and I knew that I was not alone. So today, you are not alone. Even though you are home and I'm here in my home, we are very much connected. We are connected, and we're connected through this webinar. So let's look at the overview, which is about the agenda and our learning objectives. There are two modules. The first module is to look at how your grief can become complicated in the midst of COVID-19 and how you mourn in the midst of COVID-19. That doesn't mean that your loved one died due to this pandemic, but he or she might have died during this past 3, 4, 5 months of turmoil. We have two objectives. The first is to recognize how you can process this grief and recognize how mourning theories help you cope with your loss. Let's first look at Module 1, Complicated Grief in the Midst of COVID-19. Here's where you're going to get a really good look at the intense grief you're feeling. And you know why you're feeling intense grief? It's because of separation distress. Your loved one is missing. Your loved one has disappeared. They're dead, but they're gone. Physically gone, and that really hurts your heart. So think for a moment, what brought you here? Why are you here listening to me during the next 30 minutes or so? It's because of that loss. And because you might be feeling some emotional reactions due to that loss. Maybe fear that someone else will die in your family, guilt that maybe you could have done more, angry, perhaps believing that the system failed you or failed your loved one. Distress that maybe you didn't get a chance to say goodbye, or that you're feeling what so many people are sharing in their grief is that you're lonely. Maybe you're experiencing some cognitive grief reactions. Those are your thoughts. Maybe counterfactual thinking, where you're thinking about alternative things that could have done, or maybe you should have done this, or you could have done that. Maybe you're having trouble accepting that your loved one really is dead. Maybe you're forgetful or confused or trouble making decisions. All these things are normal reactions to loss. Next, you might be experiencing behavioral reactions. Your emotions, your cognitions lead to certain behaviors in grief. You might be losing things or pacing up and down. You're seeking out places that your loved one used to hang out, or you're isolating yourself from friends and family. Now, we're isolating anyway, but maybe you're not picking up the phone when someone calls to say hello. Physically, you might be experiencing difficulty catching your breath or sighing more than you've ever sighed before. These are normal responses in grief. You might have absolutely no energy and don't even want to get up in the morning. Another thing that might be happening that your dentist might explore with you is that you're grinding your teeth, or you feel shaky on the inside. You also might be feeling some spiritual reactions. You might have created an altar where you have a photograph and a special item that belonged to your loved one. Perhaps you light a candle every single day at a special time, or you notice profound coincidences. It is amazing. Every day the lights flicker at the same exact time. Or you might even hear your loved one speaking to you from another room, or smell your loved one's perfume or aftershave, but you might have even lost your faith. So here's a question for you. What grief reaction is most difficult for you to manage? There are so many. So Andrea, what would you say is a grief reaction or two that you felt after your loved one died that was really hard for you?
Oh boy, there were just so many, and you've already touched on quite a few of them, and it was the energy. I had a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I just would question, why bother? Like, what is my purpose? Like, I just wanted to sleep. I didn't want to face anyone. I didn't want to see anyone, talk to anyone. So that was hard for me. Being a somewhat social person, it wasn't like me to just not want to see anyone. And then I was working part-time, and it took everything for me to get up and shower and get dressed and go in to work. So that's where I struggled quite a bit.
Sounds like your energy was zapped. And if your energy is zapped, emotionally, cognitively, physically, behaviorally, spiritually, it's going to affect every single part of who you are. So I'm sure that others who are listening right now, that resonated in them, that they too were feeling that, and that you gave them permission to say, you know what, I'm feeling the same thing. I'm not going crazy. This is normal. This is grief. So thank you for sharing that. What I wanted to now share is the fact that we have this thing called prolonged grief disorder. And it's a strange thing because people call it all kinds of different things, but I like to call it complicated grief. How do you know when your grief is getting complicated, that maybe you need to reach out to a professional or work on it on your own time through books and support groups and with friendships? But how do you know you're experiencing complicated grief? Well, there's some criterion. The first is that your loved one died at least a year ago. So you have to have this feeling and thoughts and actions for at least a year. Then your grief is characterized by certain things. This is intense yearning. You long for your loved one. You're pining for them. The pain of grief is so, it's like a knife in your heart, and you are thinking about your loved one all of the time. And that response is so difficult to deal with, and you're dealing with it every day for at least a month. Now, this significant distress or this impairment is really affecting every part of your functioning, and it's exceeding what's considered normal in your faith, in your religion, in your social, cultural context. Other people aren't responding to their losses this way. So you're looking at it in a way where, you know what, this bereavement is really exceeding what I felt for others in my family. And the symptoms are not better explained by some type of mental disorder. So here is the 8 things that we have to look at. And you have to have at least 3 of these things for your therapist or social worker or clinician to say, yep, you have complicated grief or you have prolonged grief disorder. So think for a moment, would you say that a part of yourself has died, that your identity has been changed? If your child died, are you still a mom? Who are you now that they're missing? The second is a marked sense of disbelief about the death. You cannot believe that they really, truly are gone, that they're not coming back. You can't get through that. You can't move to the other side of that. The third is avoidance of reminders that the person is dead. When you see your husband's coat hanging in a closet, when you see your child's toy hidden behind the couch, that reminder is such a trigger that you cannot handle it. You have intense emotional pain and you have difficulty moving on in life. You don't want to do anything, as you said before. You didn't even want to get out of bed, how hard it was to even work a part-time job. You feel emotionally numb. Your whole body goes numb. And you feel like life is meaningless. There is no meaning to your life. There's no meaning in your loved one's death. And there is intense loneliness because you're kind of sequestering yourself from people that care about you. So what are some things that might influence your grief that makes it complicated? Well, your age. If you're very, very old and most of your friends are now deceased, or if you live in a nursing home and most of your friends are gone, or maybe your child was so young and didn't have a long life. So your age, the age of the person who died. If you are struggling with comorbid factors, if you're suffering from bipolar, schizophrenia, other mental illness, that will affect your grief. If you've had many losses, many past losses that keep bubbling up because of this loss, or pre-existing trauma, especially if you had a trauma when you were very young. Another is psychological proximity, how close you were to your loved one when they died. Other things that influence and impact the way you grieve is concurrent stressors in your life. If your spouse died and they were the breadwinner, do you have to move? How are your kids going to school? Do you have enough money to pay rent? How's your family functioning? How are you coping with this? Are you coping with drugs and alcohol? Are you coping by going to church? What are you doing to cope with the intensity of the feelings that you're experiencing? We also have to recognize that there are a number of losses. Yes, you might be grieving this loss, your child, your parent, sibling, best friend. However, you might have many losses. People call into my programs and they'll say, you know, I understand that you're talking about a loved one, but my dog just died and my heart is broken and I can't eat or sleep. I miss him so much. So we have to respect that we all have so many losses in life and they're cumulative. With the COVID-19, many of us have had loved ones who died alone. They were holding the hand of a compassionate, loving nurse. That is what I truly believe in all the nursing conferences that I'm doing online. But our loved one didn't have us by their side. And that breaks our heart. And that complicates the grief. We weren't there to say goodbye. The suffering that our loved one went through and not being able to visit, not being able to share because of the place of death, whether it was in a hospital and they wouldn't let you in, or a nursing home. Maybe this was preventable or random. It was sudden, especially with the pandemic. Your loved one was healthy and a week later they're dead. It's unexpected, untimely, and very little chance for anticipatory grief. When your loved one has cancer, you know you have time. You have months, perhaps maybe even a year or so. When I worked as a hospice bereavement coordinator for a few years, I remember how wonderful it was to bring in a harp for a patient that was dying, to be able to read the Bible with the family, and to have a relationship, and knowing that that patient was going to die, or a family member knowing their loved one was going to die. There was anticipatory grief. But like in the case of my dad's suicide, it was sudden, unexpected. I didn't know it was going to happen. No one did. So I didn't have any anticipatory grief. So there are so many layers of the way we grieve and what complicates our grief. So what I'd like to focus in on now is module 2, the way you mourn. How are you doing? How are you doing with mourning in the midst of COVID-19? So in this lesson, you're going to learn about mourning theories. What are mourning theories? Well, back in the 70s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross created a stage-based model that focused in on those who were terminally ill. There were no other models at the time, and so the media and people picked up on these stages and applied them to people who are grieving. But there are no stages in grief. We don't go from one stage to the next and to the next until we're done with grieving. Grieving is a lifelong process. It's a lifelong process. It's never over. It ebbs and flows. Some days are good, and some days you're standing by the kitchen sink doing dishes, and you're hysterical, and you drop to your knees thinking about your loved one, and then you get up and you continue washing the dishes. That's mourning. It's when you express your grief. You show others that this person was robbed from you. It's the customary response to bereavement within your culture, your faith, your ethnicity, and it's these languages that you speak or clothing that you wear, things that you read because your loved one died. It's our rituals show the world that we are experiencing a loss. Well, Strobe and Schutt back in 2001 created this dual process model that I find so interesting. What they say is that when we grieve, we oscillate. So what does that mean? Oscillate. Oscillate means you move towards your grief, but it gets so overpowering that you move away from your grief. Then you move toward your grief and you say, okay, I could do this or that in regard to grief, but it gets to be too much, so you move away from your grief. It's like a yo-yo. You go into it and you move away from it. Now, there are 4 tasks of mourning. That's another grief theory that I love, and it's by Warden. And he says that if you don't create these 4 tasks in your life when you're grieving, these goal-oriented steps, your grief might be really difficult to manage. So the first task is that you have to accept the reality that your loved one really did die. That's when you discuss the circumstances of the death. That's the what happened. And you recognize all of the losses in your life, not only the primary losses that your loved one is dead, but all the secondary losses. Someone just shared with me that she was a grandma. She wanted to be a grandma, and her daughter died, and she realized with that death she will never be a grandma because that was her only daughter. So we have to recognize primary and secondary losses, and that our loved one really is not going to return. And we do that by viewing the body or giving away belongings or attending the funeral. But so many of us have not been able to attend our loved one's funeral during COVID-19. Now, with my dad, I was in the hospital giving birth to triplets, so I didn't attend his funeral. I didn't attend the wake. I couldn't do anything because I was in the hospital. My mom, however, she was a WAC in the Army, and she was a police officer. So her funeral had the draped coffin with the American flag. She had Army and police present. I was able to attend my mom's funeral, and it was a beautiful funeral. I was able to actually experience joy out of the respect that my mother was given. I was not there for my dad. The second task is to process the pain of grief. That's how we express it, whether we keep busy, whether we ask for support, whether we write in a journal, relaxation skills, attend a support group. I facilitated many, many different types of support groups, but the suicide loss support group that I facilitated in Trenton many years ago really helped me personally process the pain just by going around the room and listening to others who experienced a similar loss. Third task that Warden shares with us is that we have to adjust to our world without the deceased. We have an assumptive world. We assume our shoes are going to be where we left them, that the car is going to start in the morning. We never assume that our loved one is dead, that they will die. So we have to make all of these adjustments. Externally, we may have to learn new skills. Internally, we have a new sense of self. And spiritually, we have to find meaning. We have all these adjustments, and they're hard. We have to adjust to the world where our loved one is gone. And the fourth task is to find an enduring connection with the deceased as we embark on a new life. This connection is spiritual. Yes, physically they're gone. We know they are gone. We no longer can speak to them, have a meal with them, share our life with them, but spiritually, they come along with us. If it was a dysfunctional relationship, an abusive relationship, maybe at this time you're putting your strength and energy into healthier relationships. If it was a healthy relationship, you have to balance. And this is a balancing act of letting go and holding on to the deceased while keeping those loving memories intact. That's a gift that God has given us, that we could remember and that we could share all of those. And we could create traditions that honor our loved one's memory. We could also, and I love this theory, it's called the continuing bonds theory by Klass and Silverman. The old approach was to break the bonds, move on with life, forget the old, don't talk about them, they're dead. Well, I don't think that makes any sense. The continuing bonds theory says that you do not have to sever the bonds with your loved one, that you hold them in your memories, you share their life, you find meaning in that, and you know that they're watching you and caring for you and loving you. Continuing bonds is an ordinary aspect of every single grief theory. All the grief theories today say, yes, it's important to share. It's important to continue the bond. It's very, very healthy. So let's ask this question of Andrea. Have you continued the bonds with your loved one? I think your listeners and viewers would like to know.
Well, I feel like I have. I'm one for talking out loud, so I will sit and just talk with them. I've got, pictures that I have out that I'm, not just going to put in a box and shove under the bed. I've got a little place where I've got my dog's little urn and the last bone that she had and her toy and her collar. So I have that right beside her urn, and then of course one of my cats, I've got her there, and I miss them every day, and I still cry at times, and because I just think they brought me so much joy. And John's dad, my husband, his father passed away. It was 2 years ago this month, and we've got him there, and we talk to him from time to time, and just the memories. We just will share stories, and he was such a good man. Everybody loved him, and so it's still sad sometimes. It still hurts. You want that person here, you want that animal here, and it took me a long time to go over to the lake. We have a lake across the road that we can walk to, or just take the side by side to, and dunk our feet in, and the dogs will chase a stick. And I couldn't go for the longest time because that was my special place with Bella. And I just would go. I'd take my other dog, and he would just stand in the water, and I would just cry. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but it's not the same without her. And but then it got a little easier, and we did end up getting another dog, and she loves to play fetch at the lake, and it just, you know, it still continues to be a special place. But it was tough for a while, and I'm very connected. I'm very connected to not just, you know, my family, but to my animals, and I just love so deeply, and I grieve, and you know, we do talk about everyone has their own way of dealing, and every type of grief is unique to each other. But yeah, it just, there are no stages, that's for sure. And yeah, it's definitely a process, and it's, for me, it sure was day by day. And I appreciate the bonds that I still have with loved ones and my pets that are gone.
What I appreciate is that you shared that it wasn't only, you know, a father-in-law that died, or your pets. We are so attached to our pets. And when they die, it hurts just as much as a human dying. I have spoken to too many people that lost their pets that have said, my baby died. And it was their baby. So we can't judge them and say, well, no, I had a baby die in utero, or I had a miscarriage, or my child died by drowning. We each are unique in how we grieve and who we grieve, whether it's a pet or a human, and we should never stand in judgment of that. So thank you for sharing. I think your viewers will appreciate that very much. Let's look at meaning reconstruction. That's another one that I absolutely love, by Bob Niemeyer. And he says that meaning making is an essential part of grieving. It's something that we do by sharing our story, by sharing our loss. And that becomes a loss narrative. And what we do in sharing our story of loss, or a loss narrative, is we link meaning to it. What does it mean that your dog died? What does it mean to you when you stand by the lake and you're throwing the stick at the new dog to fetch and bring back to you? Well, what it means is that you had a relationship with another dog who you believe perhaps is in heaven, but that God gave you the gift of remembering your pet, and that you still have the love in your heart to do this with a new pet. Whatever it means to you, you reconstruct a new sense of who you are, how you find meaning in the relationship that was lost. And you revise basic assumptions about your world. You may say, you know, the world is a terrible place. Dogs only live 10 years or 12 years, and we don't ever have enough time with the people that we love. But you can have negative meanings in life. You can have positive meanings. Maybe you could think, well, you know, my pet's in heaven. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what you believe, how you take your lost narrative and find meaning in it. Here's 5 ways that I personally found meaning in my father's death. I honored his memory. I speak about suicide awareness wherever I am. Advocacy and identification with other survivors. I facilitated a suicide loss group. I'm a guest on podcasts where I talk about suicide awareness. The destigmatization of my father. I talk about his life rather than just his death, that he was a cop, that he was a great dad. Also, another way I found meaning is continuing the bond, to talk to my dad almost every single day. Do I know that he's dead? Yes, but spiritually, I know that he's listening when I need him to listen. And lastly is the ongoing impact that he had on my life. I speak about suicide awareness openly in my programs and on the radio, and hopefully prevent a suicide from happening. So, Andrea, how have you found meaning in your loss? What is the meaning of right now saying, you know, my loved one died or my dog died? How have you found meaning in that?
Well, that's, I guess, something, honestly, I haven't really thought about. Um, I'm actually not sure how to answer that question.
Well, what does it mean to have that pet in your life? What did it mean when he was swimming in the water or fetching for a stick or letting you give him a tummy rub? What did that mean to you?
Well, it just meant unconditional love. Like um, I think I said earlier that I just love so deeply, whether it's, you know, a person or a pet, an animal, and I just, the meaning is that I guess that I'll always have to have pets in my life. I mean, I get teased a lot because we are on a hobby farm, which means, you know, basically an animal farm, kind of like a mini petting zoo. So I love my animals, and they are like my kids. I don't have any kids of my own, so you know, I sort of laugh and joke that my kids have 4 legs, although my chickens just have 2. But I guess, yeah, I guess the meaning is just, thank you for bringing this up, because I guess it's something I never really, you know, thought about or put into words, but I'll just always need to have my pets around, whether it's a cat, whether it's a dog, whether it's a horse. I love them all the same. You know, I love my chickens. I, you know, love my donkeys. I love my goats. Like they're just such a big part of me, and you know, such an impact in my life that, yeah, my meaning is to always have pets, and for as long as I can, as long as I can.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as you can, and understanding that they don't have a long life, but you give love unconditionally. So what you found in that relationship is how easy it is to let, and what comfort they give you, and what love that still remains even though they've passed on. Just because they're gone doesn't mean they're really gone. Every time you stand by the water throwing that stick to this new pet, you're reminded of the love that you had for the other pet. So it kind of continues with you, which is a beautiful thing. So now I explored prolonged grief disorder or complicated grief. I want to give you 8 tips on handling these 8 problems, these 8 intense disruptions, disbelief, not being able to deal with the reminders, the pain, how you find it hard to move on with life, the numbness, how life is meaningless, and the loneliness. How can you deal with all that? And it's hard. It is really hard. So when your grief gets complicated and you're experiencing a disruption caused by the death, you could discuss who you are now and how your identity has changed since the loss. I recently did this slide on another program, and someone called in and said, my 2 children died. Both children died, a few years apart, but they both died. And she said to me, am I still a mom? See how her identity has been shattered? So that's a question she will ask herself until it makes sense to her. Who is she now? You can also identify your core beliefs about yourself and how a part of yourself has died with your loved one. You are not the same. You will never be exactly the same. But the memories of your loved one can help you identify ways to manage that disruption in your life. The second is a marked sense of disbelief about the death. So you could seek out books about bereavement online that help you understand disbelief. You can have an open dialogue about this painful emotion with someone that you trust, because it's so hard to really believe that your loved one is not coming back. Your brain can't wrap itself around that because that person was so much a part of who you are. The next is avoidance of reminders of the person that died. So maybe you could pinpoint ways you coped with things in the past that were really hard, and maybe scrapbooking or drawing, whatever it is creatively that helped you then, maybe can help you now when you're dealing with reminders, so you don't panic, so you don't scream and run out into the street. You have to recognize ways to talk to yourself when faced with a reminder, to deep breathe into it, and to not allow it to overwhelm you. The fourth is intense emotional pain caused by the death. What can you do? Maybe find ways to distract yourself from the pain. I think you mentioned that, Andrea, before, that you distracted yourself. Recognize ways to manage the pain, the anger. And to me, really, I hear a lot of rage in people when they share their story. The bitterness that other people have a spouse and I don't have a spouse, and the complete overwhelming sorrow. That you could manage it through healing strategies. And what people tell me is that music, dance, drama, journaling, support groups, there's no right or wrong way. The only way that's the right way is the way that's helping you personally deal with your loss. And the fifth is difficulty moving on with life. So perhaps you could think about and plan for the future in a positive way. Reframe your thinking rather than looking at tomorrow as a negativity day, but as a positivity day. Pursue interest, alleviate the pain, review your life goals, the goals you had before your loved one died, and the goals now after they've died. The sixth is the emotional numbness. How do you help yourself through that? It's so hard. Well, again, increase your knowledge of grief reactions, identify different pathways of self-care like exercising, getting enough sleep, a healthy diet. You have to learn ways to increase your tolerance for getting through grief. And the research shows that being mindful and diaphragmatic breathing and journaling really help the bereaved cope and manage their numbness or whatever they're feeling. And seek out professional help. Now, only 10% of people have complicated grief. Most of us get through it. It takes time. But if you're not getting through it and you're having a really difficult time, then seek out a professional. 7 is feeling that life is meaningless. So you can find meaning in the relationship, meaning in the death. I recently spoke to someone on the radio and they shared that they have a memorial tattoo. So you can connect meaning to a tattoo that you have and why you have that tattoo. Is it your loved one's name on your back? What is it? You can also identify a transitional object that holds meaning. Now, these transitional objects could be the ashes that you have, the tattoo, a piece of jewelry from your mom, maybe your aunt's purse, your father's piece of clothing, or maybe a great uncle's fishing rod. You have your son's car. But photos are the greatest transitional object. And you mentioned how you have them around your house. That's great. I remember telling someone when I was looking through my mom's things, and this is a picture of her when she was a WAC in the Army. And I said, I feel like my mom has been erased. She was such a powerhouse. Speaking to her on the phone where she's going with her friends and what she's doing and her life story. Amazing. Police officer, Army WAC, parent, loving wife, great woman. And then one day, she just disappeared. She was erased. So Andrea, do you have a transitional item that belonged to your loved one? And you did mention before that you had your pet's items. So what other things do you have?
I guess for me, mostly it would be the pictures and the urns and a couple objects from, of course, the dog and the cat. John has some nice little mementos that, like his dad's old, like shaving kit. That's kind of neat because he had that way back when he was in the Air Force. And his slippers, like his mom gave him some of his dad's clothes and his slippers. And so it's nice to see when John puts on a nice crisp shirt, and that used to be his dad's. And yeah, it's nice having that kind of stuff around, for sure.
And it's so simple. A
Yeah.
shaving kit, a photograph, slippers. And when your hubby puts his feet into those slippers, knowing that that's where his father put his feet, very, very significant, very meaningful.
Yeah.
So the 8th is the intense loneliness that we feel. Maybe you can list people who can become your support system, because after a while, people don't want to listen to us as we share our lost story. They're tired of it.
Yeah.
And so we need to sometimes find a new person who's going to listen. So we need to build relationships also with people who have experienced a similar loss. We might also experience what's called disenfranchised grief. Kendoka coined this term. It's when we can't openly acknowledge our grief. Like our dog died. People look at us, oh, come on, get over it. There's a new dog, get a new dog. Or a suicide. Oh, I don't even know what to say. But it's not sanctioned by society or publicly mourned. Like with COVID-19 right now, we can't publicly mourn, go to a funeral. Very disenfranchised and not getting the social support we need because of COVID-19. However, someone called in the other day on a radio program, and what she said was that her loved one died of a heart attack 2 weeks ago. And she called in, she was in the process of grieving. I mean, it was a brand new loss. And she said, people say, oh, I'm so sorry your loved one died. Was it COVID-19? And she goes, no, it was a heart attack. And they're like, oh, okay. And they don't give her what she needs, whether it's COVID-19 or a heart attack. She just experienced a great loss. Now, I personally experienced disenfranchised grief. I'm a keynote speaker. I speak to human service professionals, clinicians, nurses, victim service providers, and I help them with vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, because they listen to your story of loss. They listen to your story of trauma. They're present for you, and they're burning out, and they're experiencing secondary traumatic stress. So that's what I do. So imagine being on stage. I'm speaking to almost 1,000 people. It was a mental health congress. And I just finished sharing the keynote, and I still had my lavalier mic on. And everybody was clapping, and it was over. But someone in attendance ran up to the stage, onto the podium, and said into my lavalier mic so everyone heard, oh, Barbara, that was a great keynote. Thank you so much. But you do know your father's in hell. Okay. I couldn't believe that was such a disenfranchised thing to say to me, and especially to say it in front of all these people. Because I am also a pastoral bereavement coordinator, so I said, God bless you, because I couldn't punch her in the face, right? Because I'm getting paid to speak, so I have to be kind. But I got off the stage, and all of these compassionate, empathetic, and caring professionals needed to hug me or tell me my father wasn't in hell, and it was beautiful and it was compassionate. But we could feel disenfranchised at any point in time, because people are real, some people are good, some people are fake, and some people are real good at being fake. So surround yourself with people who you like, who lift you up, then get a dog or a cat. Now, I have 4 beautiful sons. When my triplets were 3 years old, I got pregnant again. Have no idea how it happened, immaculate conception. And I had but this is a picture of my triplets when they were very little. And I'm showing it because it's an amazing, look at the monkeys. Hear no evil. That's Mikey holding up his hand to his ear. Speak no evil. And Matthew is, look at his eyes. That's see no evil. So it makes me smile to look at this. It brings back memories of their childhood. And I realize now that I don't have a picture of my 4th I apologize, and I promise in the next podcast and webinar, I will put your picture. But we have to realize that we are not alone. We are not alone. I have my family and friends. You, Andrea, you have your family, you have your pets, you have your community. We have people around us, and we are not alone. Yes, I'm like this pussycat because I'm a cat lover with the headphones on, and you're probably there in your computer if you're a dog lover, but we're not alone. We're connected. We are connected through this process of Zoom webinar, and we explored grief. We explored the difficulties that we're going through, especially now during COVID-19. Now, I'm a thanatologist. I told you that I'm a specialist in grief and complicated loss, but I'm also a resilience coach, helping people understand their grief when it gets complicated and how to cope with that. I also help professionals who are truly experiencing vicarious trauma, and many are going through that this time. But you can find strength, comfort, and joy. It's not going to come to you. You have to seek it out. So at this point, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar and realize that you can keep going and you can do this. You can find joy. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. That was wonderful. But I don't even know what to say. Like, just the wisdom and the knowledge you have, and I adore you, and I love your spirit and your energy, and this was fantastic. Thank you so much for putting this together and sharing with us today, Barbara. Thank you.
And thank you for putting this series together and for allowing me to just share helping families after a suicide. You are not alone in your grief. There are resources available to help you manage your loss, books and websites. And now we have the series, Andrea, that you're putting together with several just in the field, whether you had a perinatal loss or an anticipatory loss or a loss of a spouse or friend, that we are not alone because you now have this free series for people to watch.
Yes, it's been wonderful. I'm so grateful for all the speakers that we've had on and still to come, and just everything that they're sharing. And I guess I will just end there. I want to thank my viewers for tuning in today, and I'm sure something touched your soul. And this is going to be available for you to download, which is very generous of Barbara. So thank you again for tuning in, and until the next time, as I always say, be safe, be kind to yourself, and like we've said numerous times through this half an hour, you need to know you are not alone. If you need to reach out, just remember, you're never alone. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.